China has accused the U.S. of lying to distract the world of what Beijing calls an insufficient response to the coronavirus. That's in stark contrast to what Secretary of State Pompeo believes. He says that China hasn't been transparent since the outbreak began. He also claims Beijing purposely destroyed early samples of the virus rather than share them with the world. Joining me now, Face the Nation moderator and CBS News senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan. So, Margaret, you have Secretary Pompeo, the first U.S. official to publicly make these claims. What more can you tell us about this latest dispute with China, and what really is the end game for the U.S.?
Well, this was something that, because of the seriousness, the gravity of the allegation that China could actually be blocking the rest of the world and scientists here in the U.S. from developing a vaccine that would protect arguably all of humanity against this, that we felt it was worth looking into, that this wasn't your usual sort of rhetoric of the clash between the two world powers. So Secretary Pompeo, in a series of interviews over the past about 10 days or so, repeatedly said again and again that China was refusing to share live virus samples, refusing to give access to U.S. scientists and investigators, and that was preventing, in some ways, scientists from being able to develop an effective vaccine. So we went and surveyed a number of epidemiologists and scientists. My colleague Camilla Schick and I looked into this, and what we heard was that actually, while it would have been helpful indeed for China to have shared virus samples, tissue samples, been more transparent, that at this point, it's almost too late for them to have done so. That American scientists have actually been able to work off of genetic sequences, genome sequences, and out of virus samples gathered from people who have the virus here in the United States. Why would it be this important to have this sort of clash of the two powers? And it's a complicated storyline that I'm happy to get into, but the bottom line that we found is that China, yes, is not being transparent. It is not sharing information and live virus samples, but that's not preventing American scientists from charging ahead. In fact, while it would have been helpful in the early months, it's basically too late now.
Too late now, but the sense is that they didn't get the cooperation they wanted from China. It's hard to ignore, Margaret. You know, we're obviously in the middle of a campaign cycle. At this point, the president looking to get reelected. How much of this confrontation is also a politically motivated calculus?
Well, we wanted to look into the merits of the argument because it is such a huge charge. And you can't ever really take domestic politics out of any consideration in a campaign year. So we weren't picking apart some of the other allegations made by the Trump administration against China, the theories of the origin of the virus, or that there was some concerted effort to cover. Instead, we looked at the science of it. What was the implication of not sharing some of these samples? And we did that because we wanted to understand, why the president and the Secretary of State are going so hard at China right now. Is there a reason other than domestic politics? And what we found in talking to a number of researchers is that it would indeed be very useful to understand the origin of the virus. Dr. Jonah Mazet of UC Davis told us, as an epidemiologist who has worked with Chinese researchers, including the so-called bat lady, the researcher in China who was researching bats and at the Wuhan University Institute, that is the target of some of Secretary Pompeo's criticisms, that getting those early samples would have helped to nail down exactly what kind of bat it came from, where that bat was from, whether this actually grew out of some kind of infection that came out of that wet market that you hear often the World Health Organization say was the likely origin of this virus. So there is a usefulness to getting what the Secretary of State has said the United States needs to get its hands on. But it is not a requirement to actually developing a vaccine. So you have to take into consideration that the Secretary of State is an incredible China hawk, that the United States and China are really competing in a really sort of bare-knuckled way right now. This is not just the two largest economies of the world competing with each other. There is a race to create a vaccine. And from Secretary Pompeo's perspective, as he says again and again, that basically China's trying to win a PR game, that they, as the Trump administration argues, did not take measures to protect the rest of the world from the spread of this virus. And now they want to be able to take credit for being the first to come forward with a vaccine. So that's what's motivating some of what his argument here is. But of course, there's always an overlay of domestic politics in a campaign cycle, and being able to blame another country for the problems that are devastating this one right now, having taken the lives of 60,000, projected 70,000 potentially in the weeks to come. It is a politically useful tool. It is not necessarily one that is central to the science of the matter and protecting lives going forward.
And you look at the people who are being vocal about this against China. It's not just the U.S. and the White House. Australia, for instance, calling for an international investigation that would focus on the origins of the virus in China. The World Health Organization's handling of it as well. Do you foresee this fight with China extending to even further corners of other countries and throughout the world as well?
Yes. I mean, this is the most bare-knuckled fight between the U.S. and China right now, but this has been a rivalry going on decades. It is just right now sort of really becoming raw because of the immediate crisis. And as you rightly point out, Australia, whose prime minister is also a China hawk, very closely located to China, has stood with the United States and said they want to press for an investigation specifically looking at what China did or did not do in the beginning of this outbreak. And looking at the specifics of the timeline, even when you speak to those from prior administrations, Democrats, they will say there is a lot of investigating that needs to be done in an after-action report. I talked to Gail Smith. She's currently the One campaign, but she oversaw part of the Obama administration's Ebola response and said, look, there are problems here that are worth examining with transparency. The World Health Organization is a UN agency. That means that they have wonderful diplomats and scientists, but they don't have the power to force a government to do something they don't want to. And in an environment where you have the Chinese Communist Party not being completely transparent, as the Trump administration argues, it's sort of a gridlock here. How do you force China to give up information it says it doesn't want to or that it doesn't need to? And this is why it is such an interesting model going forward for what about the next pandemic? Because you have the World Health Organization warning that given a number of different factors right now, including extreme weather events, that we could see a number of pandemics, the frequency of them pick up. So figuring out how the world can work together better next time, should there be an expectation that no matter the authoritarian government or democratic one, that U.S. investigators be allowed in alongside the World Health Organization? Should virus samples be handed over? These are the kind of bigger questions that will outlast this administration. And so it's an interesting one to try to dig into. It's a complicated one, and there's all sorts of intrigue swirling around, nailing down where this virus came from exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Margaret Brennan, I want to thank you very much for joining us.